Lars, the Invisible Elf. Long ago there was a young prince. He grew tired of palace life and wanted to see the world. The king gave him a bag of gold coins and wished him well. The prince traveled for a few years, seeing the world and spending his gold, and after a time he ran out of money. He was hungry and had nowhere to go. He wandered in the forest until he came upon a run-down little cabin. He was tired and hoped for a good place to sleep and maybe something to eat. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. He went in only to see there was nothing but an old wooden chest. He hoped there would be some food in the chest. He opened it only to find another chest. He opened that one only to find an even smaller chest. He kept opening more and more chests until they were quite small. Finally, there was just a little box. He hoped for a crust of bread or a nut or anything to eat, for he was quite hungry. Alas, when he opened the box, there was nothing in it but a piece of paper folded in half. He opened it and saw words written on the paper. He read the words to himself. He was puzzled by the words and read them again, only this time out loud. "Lars, my lad, make me glad. Bring to me what I do not have." No sooner said than a voice spoke in his ear. "Yes, master, what do you wish?" He was so puzzled by this. He looked all around. There was no one else there. He did not know what to do, and he read the words again. "Lars, my lad, make me glad. Bring to me what I do not have." Again the voice spoke in his ear. "Yes, master, what do you wish?" This time he answered, "Bring me some food." Well, in no time at all, a table appeared, covered with fruits and nuts and a fine loaf of bread. He feasted to his heart's content, all the while wondering what kind of magic could be making this happen. He wondered, who and what is Lars? He began to feel sleepy. Again he read the paper out loud. "Lars, my lad, make me glad. Bring to me what I do not have." In his ear spoke the voice again. "Yes, master, what do you wish?" "Lars, bring me a bed with blanket and pillows fit for a king." Before he could blink his eyes, a bed and blanket and pillow was right in front of him. He yawned and got into the bed. He was amazed and wondered how all of this was happening. He made one more request of Lars. "Lars, my lad, make me glad. Bring to me what I do not have." Again in his ear spoke a voice. "Yes, master, what do you wish?" "Lars, I need a palace to go with this kingly bed. After all, I am a prince and used to such things." Without a sound, he found himself in a beautiful palace. Being quite sleepy, he dozed off. He awoke to the sound of birds singing outside the window. He got up and looked around. He was in a beautiful palace, but all the rooms were quite empty. He felt all alone. He wanted to take breakfast with someone. Again he read from the paper. "Lars, my lad, make me glad. Bring to me what I do not have." Again in his ear a voice spoke. "Yes, master, what do you wish?" "Lars, bring me friends and servants and a fine breakfast for all." No sooner said than all around the prince were servants bowing, and some even curtsied. They all began eating and talking and having the best of times. All day long the prince went from room to room in the palace. He kept reading the words on the paper and having Lars bring so many things. He filled each room with furniture and lots of books and toys and games. He kept at this all morning long. He kept Lars very, very busy. Not far away there was a castle. In that castle was a king. When he looked out the tower window, he was shocked to see a palace. He asked his servants and guards if they knew of this palace. None had ever seen it before. He took off his crown and scratched his head, wondering how a palace could be built on his lands in one day without him knowing about it. He ordered his general to take an army and go tear down the palace and hang whoever had built it. As the army marched toward the palace, the prince heard it coming. He knew that sound very well, the sound of an army. He took the piece of paper and read it out loud again. "Lars, my lad, make me glad. Bring to me what I do not have." Again in his ear a voice spoke. "Yes, master, what do you wish?" The prince ordered Lars to assemble a bigger army than the one approaching. All he had to do was look out the window, and he saw his very own army guarding his palace. When the king's army arrived, they found themselves outnumbered. The prince came out and talked to the general, telling him that he wanted to be friends with the king. Then he invited the general and the whole army to a feast. Everything he thought of, he commanded Lars to do. He kept Lars very, very busy. During the feast, one of the soldiers told him of the king's daughter. She had never been seen by anyone. Rumor had it that she had never even looked at a man. The queen made sure her servants were all girls. Only the king had seen her. This intrigued the prince. He sent the general home with an invitation for the king for another feast the very next day. That night, the prince once again read the paper. "Lars, my lad, make me glad. Bring to me what I do not have." Again in his ear a voice spoke. "Yes, master, what do you wish?" He instructed Lars to bring him the princess without waking her up, and without anyone seeing her leave. When she arrived, she was quite asleep. The prince took one look at her and then another. He did not dare touch her for fear of waking her up. He sent her back, telling Lars to make sure she did not wake up. The next day, the king looked out the tower window only to see that the palace still stood. He demanded of his general why it had not been torn down. The general told him of the prince and the army and all the wonderful things in the palace, and that the king himself was invited to a feast that very day. The king again took off his crown and scratched his head, perplexed on how a palace and an army could manifest in just one day. The princess came to see the king. She told him of a dream she had, where she went to the new palace and saw all the wonderful things, and how she met the prince and fell in love. She announced to the king, "I want to be married." The king could not believe his ears. So off went the king and his company to see this new palace. The king and the prince became fast friends. The prince and the princess became fast friends too. The prince asked the king for the hand of the princess in marriage. The king agreed only after a courtship. So the courtship began and lasted for days, weeks, and even months. Finally, a wedding was held. The celebration was huge, with immense decorations everywhere, all at the hand of Lars. The prince and princess now had everything. The king had given them half of his kingdom for a wedding present. With all of these treasures, the prince rarely asked Lars for anything. One night, the voice spoke to the prince as he lay almost asleep in bed. "Do you have everything now?" The prince replied, "Yes, I do, and I have very little need for you. But I have given you nothing. You have done so much for me. Is there anything I can do for you?" Lars told him, "All I ask is that you give me that little piece of paper you found in the box." The prince replied, "Very well. After all, I have the words memorized." He gave the paper to Lars. The prince and the princess were soon asleep. The next morning the prince awoke with his teeth chattering, feeling very cold. When he opened his eyes, he was shocked. Everything that Lars had done was gone, even his clothes. The princess still had her clothes on, as they were gifts from her father. The palace and everything in it was gone. They were in the little hut, and all that was in it was the chest. The princess cried. The prince told her she should go home to her father. She argued that she should stay and help him. They looked at each other, not knowing what they should do. When the king looked out his window, he couldn't believe his eyes. The palace was gone. He took off his crown and scratched his head, wondering, how could the palace be gone? He marched off with his army to see what had happened. He came upon the little hut where the palace once stood. There he found the prince and princess. No matter what he asked, the prince refused to answer. He ordered the prince to be hung. He sent the princess home, but before she left, she paid the hangman some gold to make sure the prince did not die. The hangman made it so. He hung the prince from a tree without killing him. The prince pretended to be dead. Everyone left thinking the prince was dead. It wasn't long before a noisy cart came rumbling down the path near the hut. The cart was filled with worn-out shoes, and sitting on top of it was a little elf wearing a pointy red cap. He saw the prince hanging there and began to tease him. "Look at you, you foolish man. You lost everything and now you are dead, dead, dead. You see all these shoes? I wore them all out, fulfilling all of your wishes." He held the piece of paper right in front of the prince's face, saying, "Can you read this, dead man?" Well, the prince grabbed the piece of paper right out of his hands, and then he read it to him. "Lars, my lad, make me glad. Bring to me what I do not have." The little man vanished, and once again in his ear a voice spoke. "Yes, master, what do you wish?" The prince commanded, "Put everything back as it was before." Lars did it ever so fast. Whoosh, whish, wham! Everything was just as it was before. He even brought the princess back. The next morning the king looked out his tower window. He was shocked to see the palace was back. Once again he took off his crown and scratched his head. Off he went with his guards to see how this could be. When he arrived, the prince and princess were standing at the palace door. They welcomed him. He asked how the palace could have been rebuilt so fast as it was gone yesterday. How did you live when I had you hanged? The prince told him that trolls must have put magic dust in his eyes, as none of that really happened. The king was even more confused than before. And once again, the king took off his crown and scratched his head. All was well after that day. The prince and princess lived happily and had many children. They lacked for nothing. One day Lars complained, "I am growing moss on my shoes. I haven't worn out a single pair in a long time." The prince told him, "Lars, I cannot give you the paper back. You have done so much for me." The prince then told Lars he would hide the paper well. He put it into a little box, inside of a bigger box, put that box into a little chest, and that chest into a bigger one. Then he buried it in a very secret place. If you ever go to the Northlands, you may see a lot of holes in the ground, and you might see a lot of people digging, for it is said that some people are still looking for the box hidden by the prince.